Civilizations rise, fall, and dream again of perfection lost. Across ages and continents, humanity has hunted the shimmer of vanished worlds. Atlantis beneath the sea, Shambhala beyond the snow, El Dorado in jungles of light. Each legend begins as memory, not myth, a reflection of our hunger for purity, power, or redemption. We build and destroy, believing the lost city waits just beyond sight, proof that what was once divine might still return. In that endless pursuit, every explorer, conqueror, and pilgrim becomes the same seeker, tracing ruins not of stone, but of the paradise within ourselves. Firelight once danced on the walls of caves where the first storytellers shaped shadows into meaning. Before a single city was built, before gods had names, people gathered around flame and darkness to imagine a place where suffering could not reach them. It was never described in the same words twice. A garden beyond storms, an island untouched by hunger, a valley where the dead might wake again. Long before ink or empire, the idea of the hidden paradise had already taken root in the human mind. When rivers began to carry trade and memory between early kingdoms, that dream traveled with them. On the plains of Sumer, priests told of Eridu, the city founded by the gods themselves at the world's beginning, where divine kings ruled until the flood erased perfection from the earth. To the east, scribes wrote of Dilmun, a bright land where sickness did not exist and waters were forever pure. Its soil never knew decay. Its walls were guarded by immortality itself. In these myths, paradise was not heaven above, but a city upon the earth, visible once, lost forever, a model for every legend to come. Across tablets baked in Mesopotamian sun, the oldest epics preserved both wonder and warning. Arata, city of shining stone, stood beyond deserts and mountains, its towers mirrored in myth as the place where humans dared to rival the gods. Its fall was recited not as tragedy, but as justice. Perfection cannot belong to mortals without price. The Sumerians did not imagine the lost city as fantasy, but as history seen through divine judgment, a memory of what happens when greatness forgets its source. From these earliest tales emerged the pattern that would haunt civilizations for millennia. Each story began in harmony, advanced to pride, ended in ruin. The flood that cleansed Eridu, the god-sent storm that drowned Arata, the walls swallowed by the sea, all were mirrors of a single conviction, that perfection, once achieved, demands destruction. The myth was moral architecture as much as narrative, the city as mirror of humankind, its collapse the cost of excess. Egypt inherited the pattern and gave it form in stone. Along the Nile, temples rose as maps of eternity, each designed to replicate the lost domain of the gods. In the hymns carved for Osiris and Ra, there are echoes of an older fear, that the divine homeland lies buried beneath water and sand. The priests of Heliopolis spoke of primordial floods withdrawing to reveal the first mound of creation, a sacred hill where order triumphed over chaos. Every pyramid, every obelisk was built in imitation of that vanished summit, an attempt to remake the place where the world had begun. Their cities were not mere habitations, but recollections in limestone of a paradise drowned before memory. Beyond the Nile, in the islands and coasts of the eastern Mediterranean, sailors carried fragments of these myths westward. As trade followed the course of copper and incense, stories traveled faster than caravans. Phoenician merchants, who saw the horizon as both boundary and promise, told of islands that rose from mist and sank again when men drew near. Greek colonists in turn inherited the rumor of civilizations fallen into the sea, of temples glimpsed beneath clear water, of storms that spoke with divine anger. Long before Plato would give that island a name, the sea already held the memory of a city that drowned for its pride. In the north, Bronze Age wanderers spoke of glass-bright lakes guarding entrances to hidden realms. Celtic poets would later remember them as gateways to the otherworld. In their earliest form, they were recollections of the same ancestral truth, that somewhere beyond reach lay a place where corruption could not enter. Every culture imagined it differently. A walled garden, a mountain ringed by fire, a city of gold under waves. But beneath all variations ran the same current. Humanity had once lived in order and light, had lost it and could not cease searching. The storytellers who carried these memories were more than entertainers. In a world where history and myth were indistinguishable, they served as archivists of a collective longing. Around caravan fires, they told of merchants who vanished seeking Dilmun, of kings who sent envoys west across the desert to find Arata rebuilt, of seafarers who swore they had glimpsed walls beneath the tides. Their listeners never doubted. Loss itself was proof. If perfection no longer existed, then it must once have been real. By the second millennium BC, fragments of these beliefs had woven themselves into the consciousness of every civilization, from the Indus to the Nile. Flood tablets from Nineveh, hymns from Memphis, and chants preserved by desert tribes all repeated the same pattern of destruction and renewal. The human world, they insisted, was only the shadow of another more perfect one, sometimes buried, sometimes hidden, always waiting to be rediscovered. To remember the lost city was to remember a time when the boundary between mortal and divine had not yet hardened. Even the earliest explorers, kings disguised as pilgrims, traders who claimed to follow the winds of fortune, were acting out that inherited memory. When they crossed deserts in search of mythical valleys or sailed beyond known shores, they were continuing a quest far older than navigation itself. The desire for discovery was never purely geographic. It was a spiritual nostalgia disguised as adventure. By the time Greek mariners began charting the western seas, the concept had already crystallized. The city that fell through arrogance, the kingdom swallowed by water, the paradise that could be reached only by those the gods permitted. These were no longer regional tales, but universal archetypes. The myths of Mesopotamia had become templates for philosophy, their moral transformed into metaphor, that the perfect order destroyed by divine wrath might yet be rebuilt through wisdom. It was in this lineage of longing that Plato would later speak of Atlantis, not as fantasy, but as inheritance. The ancient world thus entered the age of writing, already haunted by memory. Beneath every epic, from the Gilgamesh tablets to the Egyptian Book of the Dead, runs the same quiet conviction that civilization itself is an echo of something lost. The walls of Eridu, the canals of Arata, the sacred hill of Egypt, the drowned islands of Phoenician rumor, all were preludes to a single idea that would never die, that somewhere beyond reach of time, perfection had once existed and might be found again. When the old kingdoms gave way to empire, the dream of the hidden city did not fade. It adapted. Myths that had once belonged to temples and caravans followed the routes of trade and conquest, finding new homes in the imaginations of conquerors who carried both the sword and the stylus. From the eastern deserts to the Aegean shores, echoes of forgotten paradises mingled with stories of real lands glimpsed and misunderstood. Along the coast of Syria, scribes in Ugarit copied hymns that spoke of a sacred dwelling where the storm god Baal built his house upon the mountain of the north. Its gates were of bronze, its walls of sapphire, its towers mirrored the constellations. Yet even this celestial stronghold was not eternal. In the cycles recited at festivals, the house of Baal fell, rebuilt only through divine struggle. Each retelling reinforced the ancient pattern: perfection achieved through harmony, lost through hubris, restored through sacrifice. In Anatolia and Crete, myths began to anchor themselves to geography. The Hittites told of cities buried beneath mountains by jealous gods. The Minoans, whose palaces at Knossos and Phaistos already seemed touched by myth, wove stories of labyrinths and kings who reached too far. The sea surrounded them as both protector and threat, a reminder that what rose from its depths could just as easily sink beneath them. Long before the Athenian philosophers spoke of Atlantis, Aegean sailors told of islands that vanished after the ground itself had shaken, a memory that would survive generations as rumor turned to legend. As Bronze Age powers waned, their myths scattered like seeds carried on the wind. The collapse that ended their age, the fires that consumed cities, the migrations that redrew maps, left ruins and survivors who remembered greatness only as story. When later peoples built on the ashes, they inherited both the walls and the words. The Hebrews, hearing the tales of older empires, reinterpreted them through moral revelation. Paradise lost became Eden, a perfect garden barred by human failure rather than divine caprice. The pattern remained, but the cause shifted inward. Sin replaced pride, and the fall of cities mirrored the fall of souls. In the Akkadian flood stories, precursors to all later deluges, divine anger had scoured the world clean of corruption. The tale passed into Hebrew scripture almost unchanged, the ark upon the waters, the cityless world awaiting renewal. Even as civilizations rose again from the silt, the flood lingered as warning. To rebuild too high was to invite the water's return. Through every age that followed, rivers carried both nourishment and threat, symbols of the divine balance humanity could never quite master. On the Nile, the priests of Thebes maintained their own interpretation of loss and return. Each morning, they watched the sun rise over the desert's edge and saw in its ascent the eternal rebirth of the drowned world. The sacred texts inscribed on tomb walls spoke of a hidden kingdom beyond the western horizon, where the justified dead would live among the blessed fields of reeds. This city of souls was no mere afterlife. It was the perfected Egypt that mortal hands could only imitate. In their rituals of renewal, the priests sought to maintain the fragile order that kept chaos, the flood without end, at bay. Even as Egypt's monuments turned to sand, its imagery survived in the imagination of the Mediterranean. Greek travelers returning from the Nile carried tales of lost sanctuaries swallowed by dunes, of columns rising from beneath drifting sands. The image of the buried temple joined that of the drowned island as twin reflections of the same truth. What was perfect could never remain visible. Beyond the great civilizations, in deserts where nomads followed stars instead of kings, the story changed shape, but not meaning. Bedouin poets spoke of vanished cities whose towers gleamed at night beneath mirages. Iram of the Pillars, Ubar, and the unnamed metropolises said to lie under the sands of Rub al-Khali. Their legends told of arrogance punished by wind and silence, of traders turned to stone for boasting of their wealth. For peoples who carried their world on the backs of camels, the idea of a city, fixed, proud, doomed, was a moral tale written across the horizon. By the first millennium BC, myths of destruction and divine retribution had woven themselves into a shared inheritance. The world's oldest civilizations had already fallen, their ruins inspiring both reverence and warning. Travelers who stood before the shattered gates of Ur or the broken ziggurats of Babylon did not see mere architecture. They saw evidence of moral decay turned to dust. The ruin itself became scripture. Storytellers in Phoenicia and Carthage refined these ideas into tales of wanderers seeking lost homes across the sea. The seafaring peoples who mapped the Mediterranean treated the ocean as a vast archive of memory, each island a page, each current a rumor. When Tyrian sailors spoke of a land beyond the pillars of Heracles, they were not inventing a direction, but reviving an instinct, the eternal belief that the lost perfection lay just beyond the last known shore. In these centuries before Plato, humanity had already created the grammar of the lost world. The Euphrates gave it the flood, Egypt the sacred geometry of paradise, the Levant, the vision of divine retribution, and the nomads, the image of disappearance beneath sand. Every future legend, Atlantis, Shambhala, El Dorado, would borrow from that original language. Whether it lay under the sea, behind the mountains, or within the jungle, the lost city was always the same story retold in new tongues, a memory of divine order destroyed, a promise that it might one day return. When the Greek philosophers finally inherited these scattered traditions, they found them already distilled into moral allegory. The city no longer needed to be seen to exist. It could live as an ideal, a warning, a mirror held up to humanity itself. From the clay tablets of Sumer to the hymns of Egypt and the trade routes of Phoenicia, the ancient world had prepared the stage. The myth awaited only a thinker bold enough to give it name, location, and purpose. Soon, that thinker would be born in Athens, and his words would transform all that had come before into the legend of Atlantis, the first lost city of the Western mind, the bridge between memory and philosophy, between the world that was and the world forever sought. In the late spring of the 4th century before Christ, an old philosopher sat beneath the colonnades of the academy and listened as his student read from a dialogue newly composed. The work was called Timaeus, and it began not with myth, but with memory, a story told to Solon, the wisest of the ancient lawgivers, during his visit to Egypt. The priests of Sais, men who measured time by the rise of the Nile, rather than the turning of Greek calendars, had told him of a mighty island beyond the pillars of Heracles, an empire that had risen from the Western Ocean, challenged the known world, and been destroyed in a single day and night of storms. To Plato's listeners, the name Atlantis was not yet legend, it was revelation. He presented it not as fable, but as moral parable, a mirror in which the ambitions of Athens could see their reflection and their warning. The tale was set in the distant age when gods still mingled with mortals, when the earth had not yet hardened into history. Atlantis, he said, had been blessed beyond measure, rich in metals, fertile in soil, adorned with palaces whose walls shone with orichalcum, a metal more precious than gold. Its kings ruled 10 provinces, its armies spanned continents, and its priests maintained the laws that bound divine order to human power. Yet beneath its perfection lay pride. The Atlanteans, descending from gods, forgot their divine measure and sought dominion over all lands within and beyond the sea. Their fleets filled the horizon, their chariots thundered across the plains of Greece and Egypt. Only Athens, then young and virtuous, resisted their tyranny. The gods watched, weighed, and decreed judgment. In a single cataclysm, the earth trembling, the sea rising, the island sank, its towers vanishing beneath the waves. What had been the mightiest empire on earth became a caution written in water. Plato's audience understood the lesson. To them, Atlantis was not history, but metaphor. The city that fell through arrogance, the empire undone by its own abundance. The philosopher was writing in an age when Athens itself had overreached, had built its own empire and lost it through war. The ruin of Atlantis served as moral reflection on the ruin of Greece. Yet as with all great parables, the story escaped its author's intention. What Plato meant as warning, later generations would take as map. His student Critias, to whom the continuation of the dialogue was entrusted, elaborated the tale with almost architectural precision. He described concentric rings of land and sea surrounding the island's capital, bridges linking its districts, canals feeding its harbors, and mountains crowned with temples. The detail was astonishing, the geography so vivid that readers could almost trace it upon a chart. He spoke of elephants roaming its plains, of silver mines and hot springs, of engineers who drew the power of nature into the service of order. To later minds, such description would prove irresistible. Myth had acquired coordinates. Plato claimed that the story came from Egyptian archives, ancient records preserved through ages of flood and fire. Solon, he said, had heard them during his exile, written them down, and passed them to his descendants until they reached the philosopher himself. To the skeptical, this was artful invention. To the curious, it was testimony. Egypt, after all, was the guardian of forgotten ages, the land where memory never died. If the priests of Sais had spoken truly, then Atlantis was not an allegory at all. It was history erased by catastrophe. In the centuries that followed, thinkers across the Greek world debated the meaning of Plato's lost island. Aristotle, his pupil, dismissed it with characteristic precision. He who invented it also destroyed it. To him, the tale was philosophy draped in fable. Yet not all were convinced. Posidonius of Rhodes, a century later, argued that Plato's geography corresponded to lands known only in rumor, the far western islands, glimpsed by Phoenician traders or Carthaginian captains who sailed beyond the straits. If one followed the line of the setting sun, perhaps one might find the remains of the drowned empire still rising from the depths. The Romans, inheriting Greek learning, carried the story with them, but stripped it of theology. To their historians, Atlantis became a curiosity, a symbol of how even the greatest powers vanish beneath time's erosion. Yet the poets could not resist its imagery. Ovid spoke of floods that erased cities. Seneca, watching waves crash upon the Atlantic cliffs of Hispania, wondered if continents might indeed lie beneath the waters. The age of reason had preserved the dream, though it could not believe it. As the centuries turned, the meaning of Atlantis evolved with the world that remembered it. When Greek independence yielded to Roman dominion, scholars saw in the drowned island the eternal pattern of rise and fall. Empires, like continents, obeyed the same law. They emerged, flourished, and vanished. In the academies of Alexandria, where Greek philosophy mingled with Egyptian mysticism, the tale acquired metaphysical weight. Atlantis became not merely a lost land, but a lost state of being, the material reflection of a spiritual decline. To lose the island was to lose contact with the divine. Meanwhile, sailors of the Hellenistic age, venturing along the African and Iberian coasts, began to seek physical proof of the philosopher's parable. They found strange rock formations beneath the sea, ancient walls on forgotten promontories, traces of masonry that seemed too old for human hands. Every ruin fed the hunger for confirmation. When storm waves uncovered fragments of drowned cities near Crete and Santorini, some whispered that Plato had spoken truth more literal than intended. The eruption of Thera, which had shattered the Minoan world 1,000 years before Plato's birth, provided a convenient explanation. Here, they said, was the source of the legend, a real island destroyed in fire and flood, its memory surviving in distorted form through generations of seafarers. Yet the correspondence between myth and geology only deepened fascination. If a real cataclysm could inspire a story of divine retribution, might there not have been another, greater, older, still waiting beneath the sea? By the dawn of the Hellenistic period, Atlantis had escaped the pages of philosophy and entered the bloodstream of imagination. Scholars debated its coordinates. Priests reinterpreted it as moral allegory. Adventurers dreamed of discovering its ruins. What Plato had written as the conclusion of a moral dialogue had become the beginning of an endless search. As ships from Alexandria and Carthage traced the curve of the known world, their captains carried not only goods and maps, but the persistent question of the drowned empire. Beyond the pillars, the Western Ocean lay vast and uncharted, its mists concealing both danger and promise. Somewhere past those boundaries, it was said, the sea still held a secret, the echo of a bell that had once tolled for Atlantis. Twilight settled over Athens as Plato dictated the lines that would outlive him. His stylus moved with measured purpose, etching a memory not his own. The Timaeus opened with the calm rhythm of reason, but within its polished dialogue lay something older, a story passed through generations, whispered by priests of Egypt to the Athenian lawgiver Solon, and by Solon to the philosophers who came after him. It spoke of a time before recorded history, when gods ruled over men and the world was still divided between sea and sky. Somewhere beyond the Pillars of Heracles, in an ocean the Greeks scarcely knew, there had been an island empire called Atlantis. The priests of Sais, according to Plato's telling, had looked upon Solon with the pity of elder civilizations addressing a younger. "You Greeks are children," they had said. "You have no old traditions, no ancient knowledge." What they offered him was memory, an inheritance of floods and fire, preserved in their hieroglyphic annals. 9,000 years before Athens, they said, a mighty power had arisen from the Western Ocean. Its kings possessed wealth beyond measure and dominion over lands that stretched even to Egypt. Their temples glittered with orichalcum. Their fields yielded harvests without toil. But pride followed plenty, and the Atlanteans, forgetting their divine portion, sought to enslave the world. Then, in a single night of thunder and flood, the island and its people sank beneath the waves. To Plato, the story served a purpose grander than wonder. His Athens, recovering from war and the decline of empire, needed a mirror in which to see itself. Atlantis was that mirror, a parable of excess punished by divine balance. The philosopher did not claim the tale as myth. He spoke of it as truth received through lineage, woven into the framework of his ideal state. The Republic had imagined the perfect city. Timaeus and Critias revealed the cost of its corruption. Atlantis was the Republic's shadow, harmony undone by hubris. Yet what began as philosophy soon took on the shape of geography. In Critias, Plato abandoned allegory for architecture. He described the Atlantean capital as concentric circles of land and sea, connected by bridges and canals, guarded by a temple to Poseidon whose roof gleamed with ivory and precious metal. Every measurement was exact, every proportion deliberate. There were mountains rich in ore, plains watered by engineered channels, herds of sacred bulls, and palaces roofed in silver. The effect was hypnotic, a myth told with the precision of a surveyor. Readers no longer pictured a parable. They saw a place. The philosophers who came after him argued over intention. Aristotle, loyal to reason, dismissed the account with a sentence: "He who invented it also destroyed it." To him, Atlantis existed only as a tool of instruction. But others were less certain. Crantor, one of Plato's earliest interpreters, claimed to have visited Egypt himself and seen the same inscriptions Solon had read. The story, he insisted, was not invention, but inheritance. From that moment, skepticism and belief would advance together, inseparable as tide and undertow. The myth's reach widened with empire. When Alexander's conquests opened routes to India and the Atlantic, soldiers and scholars carried Plato's words into lands that had never heard them. In Alexandria, where Greek and Egyptian thought converged, Atlantis became a symbol of cosmic order and loss. The priests who studied under the Ptolemies found in the tale a reflection of their own theology: the divine kingdom destroyed for forgetting Ma'at, the sacred balance between gods and men. To them, the drowned island was not merely a city, but an epoch, the final age before corruption. For centuries, the Western world would treat the story as both scripture and speculation. In Syracuse, where Plato had once courted tyrants, scholars mapped his measurements against known coasts. Some placed the island in the far Atlantic, where the sun died each evening. Others in the western Mediterranean, near the mountains of Spain. Diodorus Siculus, compiling his library of history, repeated whispers of great islands beyond the horizon, rich in all good things, where storms sometimes revealed ruins beneath the sea. Posidonius, the Stoic, argued that such lands might still exist, hidden by distance or swallowed by silt. For, he wrote, the sea itself changes its bounds. The Romans inherited the legend and gave it permanence. To them, Atlantis became the first and greatest example of what the historian Livy called fatum imperii, the fate of all empires to fall. Poets used it as metaphor. Ovid, in exile, imagined drowned temples gleaming in moonlight. Seneca, watching Atlantic storms from Spain, wondered if new worlds might one day rise where Atlantis had fallen. The myth that had once warned Athens now served to remind Rome of its own mortality. Even after centuries of conquest and decay, the idea never drowned. Sailors along the western coasts of Africa told of pillars and walls glimpsed below clear water, of strange stones on the islands near Cadiz. Natural philosophers examined fossils on mountaintops and claimed they proved a deluge vast enough to erase a continent. Every wave that broke upon the Atlantic shore seemed to whisper the same refrain. Somewhere beneath, the city still slept. What gave Atlantis its endurance was not geography, but symmetry. It united moral order and natural disaster, reason and imagination, philosophy and prophecy. In its destruction lay both punishment and promise, a warning that what vanished might also return. For the Greeks, the island marked the edge of the known world. For those who came after, it would become the map of the unknown. Thus, by the time the Hellenistic age faded into Roman dominion, the story had achieved a paradoxical perfection. It was both allegory and archaeology, both memory and dream. Every scholar who doubted it left space for wonder. Every believer who sought it added detail to its myth. In Plato's hands, Atlantis had been an example of moral decline. In the imagination of his heirs, it became a prophecy of rediscovery. When the philosopher wrote that the ocean at that time was navigable, he had no idea his words would one day guide ships into it. The vision born in the academy of an empire drowned and waiting would survive the fall of Greece, the burning of libraries, and the silence of the Middle Ages. The waves that erased Atlantis from sight could not wash it from the mind of humanity. Somewhere beyond the sunset, the story promised, lay the ruins of perfection, the evidence that mankind had once lived closer to the gods. Whether real or imagined no longer mattered. The legend had crossed the line from philosophy into faith, and from that moment on, the search for Atlantis, the search for what was lost and might be found again, became a permanent part of the Western soul. When the last philosophers of antiquity fled before the Christian dawn, they carried Plato's lost island with them. The academies that had once debated the geometry of Atlantis gave way to monasteries that saw in the ocean only the abyss of Genesis, the waters above and below creation. Yet even in the new world of faith, the story endured. Monks who copied the Timaeus in dim scriptoria did not understand its mathematics, but the moral was familiar. Pride before the fall, arrogance punished by flood. Atlantis lived on, disguised as allegory for a humanity that had defied its maker. The early theologians, inheriting both scripture and the classics, folded the drowned empire into their vision of divine order. For Clement of Alexandria and Origen, Plato's tale foreshadowed the flood of Noah, a pagan echo of Revelation. The destruction of the island, they said, proved that the Creator's justice was universal, visiting both Hebrew and Hellenic worlds alike. To the Christian mind, Atlantis became not the memory of an earthly civilization, but a symbol of Eden's ruin, the paradise corrupted by disobedience and reclaimed only through grace. Still, beneath the surface of doctrine, curiosity stirred. The Timaeus had been preserved in Greek, then Latin, its passages glossed by scholars who sensed that Plato's precision concealed something more than metaphor. His exactness of measurement, his insistence on inherited knowledge, were refused to vanish beneath theology. When the Church Fathers warned against seeking the lost island, it was precisely because some still sought it. By the first centuries of the Common Era, the Western Ocean had become the edge of the sacred map. The Romans called it Mare Tenebrosum, the Sea of Darkness, believing that ships which sailed too far would find themselves engulfed in vapors or crushed by encircling tides. Yet sailors continued to test its limits. Carthaginian fragments told of voyages beyond the straits, of islands fragrant with fruit and heavy with gold. Each rumor, however faint, revived the thought that Plato's island might have been no allegory at all but memory distorted by time. After Rome's fall, when learning retreated into cloisters and oral traditions, Atlantis sank again beneath the surface of history, surviving only in the fragile manuscripts guarded by monks. For 1,000 years, it slept between their pages. Yet its essence, civilization rising and falling through divine justice, fit perfectly within the medieval imagination. The sea that had swallowed Atlantis became the same that had drowned Pharaoh's armies. Its ruins became the warning carved into the moral order of the world. The Arabs who inherited the sciences of Greece after the empire's decline brought a new language to the legend. In their vast libraries from Baghdad to Cordoba, translators rendered Plato into Arabic and Syriac, preserving his dialogues while Europe forgot them. Scholars of the House of Wisdom discussed the lost island not as myth, but as example of natural catastrophe, reasoning that the earth itself was mutable, its continents born and buried by the motion of waters. In these reflections lay the seeds of geology and cosmology, though their authors spoke in the idiom of revelation. Atlantis, in their treatises, became one of many worlds destroyed before the creation of Adam, civilizations erased to make way for others. To sailors of the Islamic Golden Age who ventured far into the Atlantic in search of trade and knowledge, the Western Sea was no longer forbidden. Andalusian mariners told of archipelagos beyond the Canaries, of walls beneath the tide, of lights glimmering under the waves at night. The geographer Al-Mas'ud wrote of ancient islands swallowed by the sea in days long past, while Ibn Khaldun, the philosopher of history, spoke of vanished nations whose ruins might one day be found when the ocean retreated. Though they did not name it Atlantis, their descriptions traced the same outline: a civilization destroyed by its own excess, leaving only rumor as monument. Meanwhile, in the monasteries of medieval Europe, where parchment was precious and imagination bound by doctrine, the story took another shape. The moral of the lost island was rewritten in Latin sermons as the downfall of the proud. Its golden temples turned to symbols of worldly vanity. Illuminators who painted the flood of Noah often added distant towers toppling into the sea, unrecorded in scripture but echoing Plato's vision. The memory persisted in margins and glosses, waiting for the world to reopen its eyes to the horizon. When the Byzantine Empire preserved Greek learning against the darkness of the West, the dialogues survived intact, copied and commented upon by scholars who debated their meaning anew. To the philosophers of Constantinople, the moral allegory remained clear, but its geography provoked fascination. Was Atlantis a metaphor or a real land lost to time? Some pointed to the volcanic islands of the Aegean, others to the far west, where sailors spoke of new continents. The legend's geography expanded with the empire's imagination. Then came the rediscovery of Plato's texts in Renaissance Italy. The world that had once forgotten the old philosophers found itself reborn through them. Humanists translated the Timaeus and Critias from manuscripts carried by Greek refugees after the fall of Constantinople, and the lost island rose again from the sea of oblivion. To minds weary of medieval allegory, Atlantis appeared not as moral lesson, but as possibility. If the ancients had known of lands beyond the ocean, perhaps the limits of the world were not fixed after all. As mariners prepared to sail beyond the pillars once more, the story that Plato had written as a warning became a beacon. The search for Atlantis would soon leave the libraries for the open sea, its mythic shores guiding the course of the age of discovery. But before the sailors hoisted their sails, the scholars of Europe debated maps rather than faith, seeking the exact point where philosophy might meet the horizon. For the first time since Plato's own day, the question was not what Atlantis meant, but where it had been. When the monks of medieval Europe opened the parchment folios of Timaeus and Critias, they found the letters faint, the edges darkened by centuries of handling. Few among them understood the geometry of Plato, or the allegories that moved beneath his words, but the vision of a drowned city caught their imagination as few pagan tales could. Atlantis, they wrote in the margins, was a premonition, a pagan echo of Noah's flood, a warning carved in salt and memory. The story survived not because it was understood, but because it refused to die. As empires fell and faith replaced philosophy, the moral of the legend changed with its custodians. For St. Augustine, writing in the 5th century, the idea of an earthly paradise destroyed by sin could only confirm revelation. Pagan philosophers, he reasoned, had glimpsed fragments of divine truth, but failed to recognize the creator behind them. The flood that swallowed Atlantis was the same judgment that had drowned the world of Genesis. Augustine placed the island not in the physical ocean, but in the moral one, the abyss between human pride and divine law. The centuries that followed layered new meanings upon the tale. In the libraries of Byzantium, Greek scholars debated whether Plato's precise measurements described the Aegean or lands farther west, beyond the setting sun. The Christian world of Europe, however, had little use for such speculations. To them, the Atlantic was the edge of existence, the sea of darkness from which Jonah had fled and into which souls fell when they strayed too far from God. And yet, even among monks and chroniclers, a spark of curiosity survived. Some maps of the 12th century mark distant islands with strange symbols: Antillia, High Brazil, Isla de San Brandon, each perhaps a distorted reflection of the philosopher's vanished land. The legend changed shape in the hands of Arab geographers who inherited Greek science through translation. In Baghdad's House of Wisdom, the works of Plato and Aristotle were rendered into Arabic, their meaning dissected by scholars who sought to reconcile reason and revelation. The philosopher Al-Farabi saw Atlantis not as history, but as allegory for the perfect state undone by material corruption. Others, like Al-Mas'ud, spoke of islands swallowed by the ocean in ancient times, their ruins visible beneath clear waters. From such accounts, a new synthesis emerged. Plato's drowned empire became one among many cycles of destruction and renewal, through which the world continually remade itself. These ideas drifted westward with the Moorish scholars of Al-Andalus, entering the Latin world through translation centers in Toledo and Palermo. There, under Christian and Muslim patronage alike, scribes copied the Greek texts into new tongues. The translators who rendered Timaeus into Latin did not see themselves as reviving myth, but as restoring knowledge lost since Rome. By the 13th century, Plato's dialogues circulated once more through the universities of Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, often read alongside commentaries by Averroes and Avicenna. Philosophy, long confined to monasteries, had returned to public life. It was in this climate of rediscovery that the old island began to rise again, not from the ocean, but from the page. Medieval theologians debated whether any land could exist beyond the equatorial heat, where the church believed the air unfit for life. The question had profound theological weight. If there were continents unmentioned in Scripture, what place would they hold in the divine plan? Some dismissed the possibility entirely. Others argued that the flood might have reshaped the earth, hiding lands once known to the ancients. Atlantis became a convenient bridge between revelation and rumor, a vanished world that explained both the flood and the unknown. The age of scholasticism approached the legend with the tools of dialectic rather than imagination. Albertus Magnus, cataloguing the natural world, speculated that continents might indeed lie beneath the Western Sea, their destruction caused by celestial imbalance. His pupil, Thomas Aquinas, treated the question with caution, admitting that ancient sages might have possessed knowledge now lost. Yet for both, the moral lesson outweighed the geography. Atlantis was the city of man, condemned for loving creation more than the creator. Outside the universities, however, the legend began to breathe again in poetry and romance. Troubadours sang of enchanted isles where knights sought forbidden wisdom. The Irish monks who had long told of High Brazil, a land glimpsed once every 7 years, carried its image to the western coasts of Europe. Mariners spoke of islands that rose and vanished with the mist, Atlantis reborn in Celtic clothing. On the sea charts of Genoa and Majorca, cartographers began to dot the Atlantic with archipelagos never seen, but often believed. By the 14th century, as Europe recovered from plague and war, its gaze turned outward once more. The trade routes of Venice and Genoa stretched into the Atlantic, where the Canary Islands and Madeira hinted at lands beyond the known. Pilots returning from those coasts reported strange ruins and terraced hillsides that seemed older than memory. Chroniclers, eager to weave the discoveries into the language of the ancients, recalled Plato's tale. Could these fragments be all that remained of Atlantis? In Florence, where humanist learning revived the forgotten brilliance of Greece, scholars rediscovered Plato not as theologian, but as genius. Marsilio Ficino, translating the dialogues under the patronage of Cosimo de' Medici, infused them with the reverence of revelation. To Ficino, Atlantis represented more than moral decline. It was the divine civilization from which all others descended, a primal age of harmony between spirit and matter. His Neoplatonism merged the myth with prophecy. The world, having fallen into darkness, would one day recover the wisdom of the Atlanteans through the rebirth of philosophy. Such ideas found eager disciples among cartographers, mystics, and navigators, who saw in the rediscovery of ancient knowledge a mandate for exploration. The Renaissance transformed the myth from warning to promise. No longer a moral allegory, Atlantis became an ideal waiting to be reclaimed. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 sent scholars and manuscripts westward, carrying with them Plato's words and the conviction that knowledge lost in the East might be regained through discovery in the West. In Portugal, where Prince Henry the Navigator gathered sailors and scholars at Sagres, Plato's island was studied not as parable, but as destination. Mariners trained in astronomy and geometry pored over ancient maps, searching for the coordinates of paradise. Some claim to have seen strange lights beneath the sea at the edge of the Azores. Others swore that volcanic islands rising from the depths were Atlantis itself, momentarily unveiled. The rediscovered wisdom of antiquity met the instruments of the New Age, compass, astrolabe, and quadrant, turning philosophy into navigation. Even the theologians, who might have condemned such curiosity as heresy, found ways to sanctify it. The age of discovery, they argued, fulfilled divine prophecy. If Atlantis had once fallen for its pride, perhaps God now permitted men to find it again as a test of humility. The sea that had been a symbol of divine wrath became a path to redemption. As Europe's ships pushed farther into uncharted waters, the story acquired a new urgency. Reports of islands glimpsed and lost spread through taverns and courts. When Columbus read the translated dialogues before his first voyage, he noted in his journal that the lands he sought might well be those beyond the ocean sea, which the ancients called Atlantis. The myth that had begun as Plato's moral reflection had become the charter of exploration. But before sails filled and caravels crossed horizons, Atlantis had already changed European thought in subtler ways. It had revived faith in human potential, the belief that wisdom lost could be regained, that the world itself still held secrets waiting to be claimed by reason. The Renaissance mind, shaped by classical learning and Christian hope, found in the drowned empire a perfect emblem of its own ambition. A civilization destroyed by pride, yet reborn through inquiry. In the manuscripts illuminated for princes and popes, the island reappeared in vivid color, concentric harbors, golden temples, and fertile plains stretching under a sun that never set. Artists painted it as both Eden and utopia, a vision of what might have been and what might yet be. The philosopher's warning had become the dream of rebirth. By the dawn of the 16th century, that dream had leapt from parchment to tide. Every voyage westward carried with it the same question that had haunted Plato's listeners 2,000 years before. What if it were true? The legend that began as parable of ruin had become the prophecy of discovery. And so, as Europe prepared to sail into the uncharted ocean, the memory of the drowned island rose again on the horizon. no longer a moral lesson but a promise, no longer a mirror of decline but a map of destiny. The search for Atlantis, once confined to philosophy, would soon become a voyage written in wind and water, its echoes stretching from the academies of Athens to the decks of ships bound for the New World. The dawn that broke over the 15th century found Europe in the grip of rediscovery. The fall of Constantinople had scattered Greek scholars across Italy, carrying with them the last embers of antiquity. In their trunks and satchels were manuscripts long thought lost, among them the complete texts of Plato. When the scribes of Florence and Venice unrolled those fragile pages, it was as if the ancient world itself had risen from the sea. Among the treasures recovered, none stirred more fascination than the story of Atlantis. To the scholars of the Renaissance, the lost island was not a fable, but a revelation from an age of divine reason. Timaeus and Critias spoke to them with a clarity that transcended time. The philosophers of Athens, it seemed, had not dreamed but recorded. Where medieval monks had seen allegory, the humanists saw testimony. The language of Plato, precise, harmonious, filled with geometry and proportion, appeared to describe not metaphor, but measurement. In their minds, Atlantis became proof that ancient wisdom had once joined science and spirit in perfect union, a harmony now waiting to be restored. The revival began in the study of Marsilio Ficino, whose translations of Plato's dialogues for Cosimo de' Medici transformed philosophy into scripture for a new age. Ficino read Atlantis through the lens of his own Neoplatonism, seeing in the drowned kingdom the mirror of a cosmic fall, the descent of the divine world into matter, and the promise of its ascent through knowledge. His disciples spoke of the Prisca Theologia, the primordial theologies from which all religions had sprung. Atlantis, they believed, had been its cradle, the first civilization where divine truth and natural law had once been one. Such ideas found echo in the circles of Pico della Mirandola and Giovanni Pontano, where scholars debated the origin of human wisdom. If the flood had wiped away earlier worlds, might Atlantis not have been the lost source of Egypt's mysteries and Greece's geometry? Ficino's translations of Hermetic texts, believed to predate Moses himself, seemed to confirm it. The age before history, when gods and men had spoken as equals, was imagined anew as the Atlantean era, the golden dawn before the fall of time. The myth was reborn just as Europe began to look westward. In the courts of Lisbon and Seville, navigators studied ancient writings alongside new maps, convinced that Plato's words contained geographic truth. Prince Henry the Navigator's school at Sagres became both monastery and laboratory. Scholars compared the philosopher's description of concentric harbours to the bays of the Azores, to volcanic calderas glimpsed by sailors returning from the Atlantic. The myth that had once warned against human pride now guided compasses and financed voyages. Christopher Columbus, reading the Timaeus in Latin translation, noted in his journal that he believed lands existed beyond the ocean, which the ancients had known, but which the flood had concealed. His conviction drew strength not only from scripture, but from Plato. To sail westward was, for him, to reverse the catastrophe of Atlantis, to rediscover what had been drowned. In Italy, cosmographers and philosophers merged this hope with prophecy. Giordano Bruno, whose mind encompassed both faith and fire, declared that Atlantis had not perished but evolved, that its wisdom had migrated across ages, hidden in symbols and languages waiting to be decoded. To Bruno, every voyage across the ocean was the outward reflection of an inward quest. the soul seeking to restore the lost harmony between heaven and earth. He paid for such heresies with his life, but the idea outlived the flames. By the turn of the 16th century, the New World had transformed from speculation into fact. Spanish and Portuguese fleets returned with news of continents vast and fertile, inhabited by peoples whose monuments rivaled those of antiquity. In the plazas of Seville, the discovery of America sounded like the resurrection of a legend. The chronicler Oviedo called it a second creation, while missionaries, writing from Mexico and Peru, described temples and cities that seemed carved from Plato's imagination. To them, the empires of the Aztecs and Incas were echoes of Atlantis, civilizations that, like the ancient island, had once touched the divine and fallen through pride. Europe heard these reports with fevered excitement. Scholars in Venice, Paris, and Antwerp argued that the Americas were the remnants of Plato's lost world. The chain of the Antilles, whose name itself recalled Antilia, appeared as fragments of the submerged continent. Maps of the age depicted the Atlantic not as void, but as resurrection, old land rising again to meet new discovery. What had been allegory for the Greeks became geography for the Renaissance. Yet the new explorers sought not only gold, but confirmation. The Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher, a century later, would print a great map showing Atlantis in the center of the Atlantic, its capital precisely aligned with the Azores. Drawing on reports from conquistadors and missionaries, he argued that all civilizations, Egyptian, Greek, and American, descended from a single primordial empire destroyed by the flood. His Mundus Subterraneus blended scripture, science, and vision into a single tapestry. The earth as living organism, its continents rising and sinking in rhythm with divine will. To him, Plato had written not parable, but prehistory. Such interpretations blurred the line between faith and discovery. For the Christian humanists of the 16th century, Atlantis became the lost Eden, restored by exploration. The philosopher Thomas More, composing Utopia, drew unconsciously on the same current of thought. An island across the ocean where reason governed, where order mirrored divine justice. The new continent offered Europe both mirror and escape, proof that paradise could be found again, and that knowledge could redeem what pride had destroyed. In Spain, poets turned the theme into epic. Garcilaso de la Vega, writing of his mother's Incan heritage, described Peru as the memory of Atlantis reborn. Others went further, claiming the native peoples themselves were descendants of Atlanteans who had escaped the cataclysm. The myth that had once condemned empire now justified it. Conquest became reclamation, the recovery of a lost inheritance. Where Plato had warned against ambition, the conquerors saw divine mission. Renaissance art reflected the transformation. Painters filled palace ceilings with visions of the island's destruction, towers sinking, seas rising, chariots overturned by waves, images of awe, not guilt. The catastrophe no longer symbolized divine punishment, but natural wonder, the sublime power of creation in motion. In the engravings of Giovanni Stradano and Jan Sadler, Atlantis sank not in disgrace, but in glory, its fall rendered as spectacle of light and fury. The tragedy had become theatre, the moral had become myth. Meanwhile, philosophers continued to search for its meaning. Francis Bacon, in his New Atlantis, 1627, imagined the island restored as a scientific utopia, ruled by scholars who mastered nature through knowledge rather than defied it through pride. His House of Solomon embodied the Renaissance dream of perfect understanding, a world rebuilt not by divine miracle, but by human reason. Bacon's vision turned Plato's circle full. What had begun as caution against ambition ended as justification for it. By the 17th century, the legend had taken permanent residence in the European mind. It appeared in sermons and treatises, in mariners' logs and scientific hypotheses. The flood had become geology, the lost empire anthropology. Yet beneath every rational explanation lingered the same yearning that had haunted the priests of Sages, the belief that humanity was remembering rather than inventing, rediscovering rather than imagining. Atlantis had thus crossed its third threshold. Born as moral allegory, transformed by religion into symbol, it had re-emerged as historical destiny. The philosophers of Athens had dreamed of justice. The Renaissance dreamt of discovery. Both were bound by the same faith, that somewhere in the depth of the sea or the heart of man, the lost perfection of the world still waited to be found. The search had only begun. Ships that left Lisbon and Cadiz now carried not only compasses and charts, but fragments of Plato's prophecy, engraved upon their souls. They sailed west, chasing the sun into the ocean's silence, convinced that beyond the horizon lay the ruins of paradise, and perhaps, in their own ambition, the beginning of another fall. High in the wind-swept plateaus, where the Himalayas rise like a frozen ocean, the legends of a hidden kingdom began to take form. Long before the name Shambhala was written in scripture, travelers from India spoke of a luminous valley, concealed beyond mountains, impassable to ordinary men, a place where the earth itself seemed to breathe peace. There, they said, a sacred king reigned in perfect harmony with the cosmos. The rivers glittered with purity. The air itself carried wisdom. It was no mere city, but a vision of order, unbroken since the beginning of time. Its first descriptions came from the Kalachakra Tantra, a scripture composed around the 10th century, when Buddhism was spreading through lands already layered with myth. In that text, Shambhala appeared as both sanctuary and prophecy, the refuge of truth in an age of decline. Its rulers guarded the final teaching of the Buddha, waiting for the day when darkness would consume the world and they would ride forth to restore the Dharma. Each detail shimmered with double meaning. The mountains that protected the kingdom were also barriers of ignorance. The journey to Shambhala was both pilgrimage and awakening. Yet the legend did not begin in Buddhism alone. Beneath its Sanskrit syllables lay older roots from the Vedic age, where poets had sung of Uttarakuru, the northern paradise, a land beyond the Himavat, where virtue ruled without decay. The myth flowed like the rivers descending from the snows, gathering new languages as it went. When the Buddhist monks carried their scriptures north into Tibet, the ancient vision followed them, transformed into promise. The Tibetan lamas spoke of Shambhala not as distant myth, but as reality hidden behind illusion. In their monasteries, perched among glaciers, they taught that the path to the kingdom was invisible to the impure. Only the enlightened could find the gate that opened between worlds. The teachings described it with calm precision, an 8-petaled lotus of valleys encircling a radiant capital, its streets aligned with the stars, its palace crowned by a stupa of light. At its center sat the Kalki, the king of the future, embodying both monarch and sage. To the people of the high plateau, weary of invasions and the slow erosion of their faith, the tale was not fantasy, but solace. In the cycles of Buddhist cosmology, the world decayed through ages of moral decline, yet Shambhala endured beyond corruption. When the final darkness came, the wars of greed, the forgetting of the sacred, the last king would appear, wielding wisdom as weapon, and the world would be remade in compassion's image. As trade routes crossed the steppes and deserts of Central Asia, The story spread with caravans and pilgrims. Merchants who traveled between India, Tibet, and China carried more than silk and incense. They carried visions. In their telling, Shambhala became both mountain fortress and celestial city, both hidden valley and spiritual principle. The Mongols, hearing of it through Buddhist envoys, wove it into their own cosmology. They called it the realm of the North, a kingdom of immortals whose favor ensured victory in war. To them, the hidden kings of Shambhala were not remote sages, but allies unseen, protectors of those who rode beneath the eternal blue sky. From China came another echo. Taoist travelers, seeking the lands of the immortals described in their own ancient texts, recognized in Shambhala a reflection of their Penglai, the paradise isle where sages dwelled beyond mortality. When Chinese monks journeyed westward along the Silk Road, they recorded tales of mountain kingdoms whose people never aged and whose cities gleamed with crystal towers. Each culture mirrored the others, each transforming the ideal into its own image of perfection. In the 12th century, as Buddhism flourished under the patronage of Tibetan kings, the legend of Shambhala was woven into ritual and prophecy. Monks recited the Kalachakra initiation, a ceremony that promised eventual rebirth in the hidden kingdom to those who mastered its mysteries. Pilgrims set out to find the sacred valley, though none could say precisely where it lay. Some claimed it was north of the Gobi, others that it floated beyond the stars. The true seekers were told that the journey itself was the test, the physical road leading nowhere until the inner one was complete. The Mongol age deepened the myth. When Genghis Khan's empire stretched from China to Persia, Buddhist lamas whispered that the great conqueror's victories fulfilled part of the ancient prophecy, that the age of the wheel, the Kalachakra, had begun to turn again. Chronicles of the time record that emissaries from Tibet visited the Mongol court, offering spiritual legitimacy to empire. In their sermons, the hidden king of Shambhala became the celestial patron of earthly rulers who brought order to chaos. To warriors hardened by conquest, the idea of a kingdom ruled by wisdom rather than fear was intoxicating, but the legend remained elusive. The maps drawn by Persian and Chinese geographers showed blank expanses beyond the northern mountains, regions marked only with dragons or the word unknown. Travelers returning from the steppes spoke of dazzling cities glimpsed through sandstorms, of monasteries that vanished when approached. A few claimed to have found Shambhala and lived to tell it. One such account, recorded by a wandering monk from Samarkand, described a valley encircled by snow peaks that shine at midnight, where bells ring without hand and the air itself murmurs sutras. No one could verify it, but the tale spread faster than any caravan. When the Islamic scholars of Central Asia heard these stories, they interpreted them through their own mysticism. To the Sufis, Shambhala was not a place, but a state of being, the hidden city within the heart, where the soul meets God. Their poets called it Hurkalya, the land of pure form, unseen yet more real than stone. Thus, even as faiths differed, their metaphors converged. The paradise beyond mountains, the lost city beneath waves, the garden within the soul, all pointed toward the same invisible truth, that perfection existed, but only for those able to perceive it. By the 14th century, as Tibetan Buddhism matured into distinct schools, Shambhala became both symbol and lineage. Lamas traced their teachings to its kings, claiming that each new generation of masters represented its continued presence on earth. The monastery walls were painted with scenes of the hidden realm, lotus lakes, radiant towers, processions of celestial beings. To the faithful, these were not imagination, but memory. Every mountain pass seemed a possible threshold, every mist a veil concealing the road. When early European travelers reached the edges of Central Asia, they heard rumors of a city that could not be found on any map. Marco Polo, crossing the Pamirs, recorded tales of northern kingdoms ruled by priests who knew the movements of the stars. Though he never called it Shambhala, the resonance was unmistakable. Later, Jesuit envoys to Tibet, hearing similar stories, tried to identify it with the earthly paradise of Christian law. The hidden valley became a bridge between East and West, its name changing, but its essence unaltered. The dream of a realm where the divine still walked among men. For the people who lived beneath those endless skies, the legend was more than comfort. It was inheritance. Empires rose and fell across the steppes, but Shambhala remained untouched, the invisible capital of faith. Its kings never aged, its gates never closed, its promise never dimmed. In every age of turmoil, new voices claimed to have seen its glow at dawn, or heard its bells in the wind. None could prove their visions, but none could silence them. By the close of the medieval world, Shambhala stood as the spiritual counterpoint to Atlantis. Where the Greek island had drowned for its pride, the Himalayan kingdom survived through purity. One was the memory of loss, the other the hope of renewal. Between them stretched the full compass of humanity's longing to explain the ruin behind us and the paradise before us, the city beneath the sea and the one above the clouds. And in the centuries to come, explorers and mystics from far beyond Asia would follow those same winds and echoes, searching not for gold or empire, but for the last hidden city of the earth, the kingdom said to lie just beyond the horizon of the soul. When the first rays of the modern age began to touch the roof of the world, the myth of Shambhala still lingered in the mists above Tibet. For more than 5 centuries, it had been the spiritual axis of Himalayan civilization, a kingdom unseen yet ever present, both prophecy and refuge. But now, new travelers came from the west, drawn not by faith, but by curiosity. They arrived with sextants instead of prayer wheels, measuring what others had only dreamed. Yet even these cartographers of empire, hardened by mountains and solitude, found themselves humbled by a legend that no compass could fix. By the 17th century, reports of Shambhala had reached the courts of Beijing and Moscow. Mongol and Tibetan lamas, serving as envoys between kingdoms, told of a northern realm beyond the deserts of Gobi, protected by snow and secrecy. The Qing emperors, fascinated by the legend, invited Tibetan monks to their capital and sponsored translations of the Kalachakra Tantra. In these ceremonies, performed before golden altars in the Forbidden City, Shambhala was invoked not as fantasy, but as sacred lineage, the pure kingdom whose spiritual authority legitimized all others. The Manchu rulers, claiming divine mandate, saw in its prophecy a mirror of their own. Meanwhile, Jesuit missionaries traveling through Asia carried back to Europe accounts of an astonishing kind. One report, penned by Father Esteban Cachella in 1627, spoke of a land called Shambhala, said to be north of Tibet, where dwell the wisest and most virtuous of men. He never found it, dying on the Himalayan trail, but his words lit the imagination of scholars who read them in Lisbon and Rome. In their minds, Shambhala became the eastern echo of Eden, the paradise that had eluded Columbus's compass and Magellan's maps. For Tibetan mystics, these foreign rumors only confirmed what had always been known, that Shambhala revealed itself only when the world was ready, or when the seeker was. Lamas told of travelers who disappeared into the mountains and returned transformed, their eyes bright with knowledge no scripture contained. One such story told of a shepherd who followed a white crane into a valley filled with music. He lived there a single night, yet when he emerged, his beard had turned silver, and his voice carried the weight of centuries. "I have seen the wheel of time," he whispered, "and it turns still." Through Mongol and Chinese intermediaries, the myth drifted westward again. Muslim geographers on the Central Asian frontiers began recording tales of a luminous fortress city beyond the Altai Mountains. In the chronicles of Al-Ghaznavi and Al-Biruni, the story merged with older Arab traditions of Iram of the Pillars, the city of perfection buried beneath the sands. The old parallels resurfaced, one lost to flood, one to desert, one hidden among ice. To the scholars of Samarkand, these were not contradictions, but affirmations. The divine kingdom moved like a mirage across time, visible only to the pure of heart. The 18th century transformed legend into inquiry. Russian envoys, expanding their empire across Siberia, heard of Shambhala from Buddhist lamas along the frontiers of Buryatia and Mongolia. Some officers recorded the tales with fascination, others with unease. They spoke of monks who guarded maps leading to a northern paradise, of rituals claiming to open invisible doors through meditation. The idea that a hidden realm existed within the Tsar's dominion unsettled men who believed the world could be measured in versts and taxes. In St. Petersburg, philosophers of the Enlightenment dismissed such rumors as superstition. Yet the word Shambhala began to appear in journals of geography and comparative religion. The scholars who had sought Atlantis beneath the Atlantic now looked for its counterpart among the mountains of Asia. Each new expedition sent into the Himalayas seemed to return with stories stranger than before. Valleys where compasses failed, monasteries that vanished behind clouds, hermits who spoke of kings who had never died. As the 19th century dawned, Western science marched into the East with equal measures of arrogance and awe. The great game between Britain and Russia turned Central Asia into a theater of espionage and exploration. Officers disguised as pilgrims crossed the passes of Ladakh and the plains of Mongolia, mapping rivers and measuring altitudes, yet all reported the same enigma. Among the Tibetans, belief in a hidden kingdom was absolute. "They speak of it as we speak of heaven," wrote a British surveyor, but with more certainty. Theosophists and mystics in Europe seized upon these reports as revelation. Helena Blavatsky, claiming instruction from Tibetan adepts, declared Shambhala the spiritual center of the world, a vortex of higher consciousness, guiding the evolution of humanity. To her followers, the Himalayas became not a frontier, but a veil, behind which dwelled beings of immense wisdom who watched the progress of civilization. The myth, once local, had become planetary. Explorers soon followed belief. The Russian painter and mystic Nicholas Roerich led an expedition through Tibet in the 1920s, seeking both artistic inspiration and the gates of the hidden kingdom. His journals describe mountain storms that seemed to speak, lights that hovered above ridges, and lamas who greeted him as if expected. Shambhala is not legend, one abbot told him. It is the heart of all lands, visible only to those who carry peace within. Roerich returned without proof, but his writings convinced thousands that the kingdom was near, perhaps not on maps, but in the conscience of humanity itself. Western scientists, too, could not resist the enigma. Some sought to locate Shambhala through logic, tracing its supposed coordinates to valleys of Altai, Karakoram, or Kailash. Others proposed that it was not in Asia at all, but a distorted memory of ancient Central Asian kingdoms, or even echoes of Greek colonies lost in time. But for every rational explanation, new testimonies arose. Russian settlers in Siberia told of monks who vanished into caves that led to subterranean sanctuaries. Chinese pilgrims wrote of cities glimpsed in mirages that vanished with the wind. For Tibetan lamas, the foreign speculation mattered little. Their Shambhala was never meant for discovery by armies or scholars. It remained the inner kingdom, the promise that enlightenment could flourish even in an age of decline. The Kalachakra Tantra continued to be recited in monasteries from Lhasa to Buryatia, its verses describing the final war between light and ignorance. The prophecy declared that when the world's violence reached its peak, the king of Shambhala would appear, leading an army of compassion to restore the Dharma. By the early 20th century, the legend had fused with politics and mysticism alike. In the turbulence that followed the fall of empires, revolutionaries and prophets alike invoked its name. In Mongolia, partisans fighting foreign occupation claimed the protection of Shambhala's invisible armies. In Tibet, monks interpreted foreign invasions as signs that the final cycle of the Kalachakra was nearing its fulfillment. The kingdom that had once existed beyond the horizon now lived in the heart of resistance, a spiritual nation uncolonized by any power. To Western writers, it became the archetype of the hidden world. What Atlantis had been to the sea, Shambhala became to the mountains. Novelists and explorers wrote of secret valleys where time slowed, where eternal youth and perfect wisdom coexisted. The lost horizon of modern imagination was only a new name for the old myth. In every version, the same yearning persisted, a place beyond decay, immune to history's ruin, where humanity might begin again. And so, across centuries, Shambhala remained untouched, neither found nor disproved, existing in the space between geography and faith. In the ruins of monasteries bombed by war and the archives of universities filled with maps, the legend endures. It reminds those who listen that some kingdoms are not meant to be conquered or charted, but remembered. While Atlantis had drowned in the pride of knowledge, Shambhala survived through the humility of wisdom. The one spoke of the world's fall, the other of its redemption. Between them stretched the journey of human longing, from the depths of the sea to the peaks of the sky, each city a reflection of what humanity hopes to regain, a home where the divine still dwells, waiting to be found by those who have learned how to see. When the Spanish first glimpsed the New World, they believed they had found the edges of paradise. The jungles shimmered like molten glass. The rivers ran broad and bright as mirrors, and the native cities, vast, ordered, and dazzling, seemed proof that the ancient fables had been true. In these lands of sunlight and thunder, the dream that had begun with Atlantis found its western reflection. But where the Greek island had drowned through pride, and Shambhala had endured through purity, the New World offered a third revelation, that paradise could be pursued through greed. The legend of El Dorado, the Golden One, began not in gold, but in ritual. In the highlands of Colombia, among the Muisca people, new kings were crowned with a ceremony of fire and water. At dawn, the ruler bathed in sacred Lake Guatavita, his skin covered with powdered gold that caught the rising sun. From rafts of woven reeds, priests cast offerings into the depths. Emeralds, obsidian, figures of jaguar and eagle, symbols of the earth's riches returned to the gods. When the wind died and the lake shone still, the gilded man dove beneath the surface, surrendering his treasure to the divine. To those who watched from the shores, it was a vision of radiance and faith. To the Spaniards who heard the tale, it was a promise of unending wealth. By the 1530s, the story had crossed mountains and tongues. Soldiers who had survived the wars of Peru whispered of a kingdom to the north, where streets were paved with gold dust and the walls of temples glowed like sunrise. Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, leading one of the first expeditions into the Andean interior, sought not the man, but the city. His men hacked their way through swamps and fever-ridden forests, their armor rusting, their tempers dissolving in heat. Behind them, a trail of bones marked where the jungle had claimed the slower or the sick. Yet each glimpse of metal glinting in the rivers renewed their conviction that El Dorado was real, perhaps a few days' march beyond the next ridge, perhaps just beyond death. They reached the Muisca Confederation and found not golden cities, but people who traded gold as casually as Spaniards traded salt. Quesada's chroniclers described markets gleaming with ornaments, temples lined with offerings, and lakes whose bottoms sparkled with treasures thrown to the gods. For a moment, the conquerors believed they had found the edge of myth. Yet when the Spaniards melted the ornaments for bullion and found the quantity finite, the dream only expanded. If this was not El Dorado, then the true one must lie farther on. So began the greatest mirage in history. From Quesada and Benalcázar in the north, to Francisco de Orellana and Gonzalo Pizarro in the south, each generation of conquistadors set out into the unknown, convinced they followed the golden trail. The story shifted with every retelling. Sometimes El Dorado was a man, sometimes a city, sometimes a kingdom or empire hidden beyond mountains or buried under forests. Its location wandered like a will-o'-the-wisp, north toward the Orinoco, west into the Andes, east into the endless rivers of the Amazon. Wherever one expedition failed, another began. The first to chase the myth to its breaking point was Francisco de Orellana, who in 1541 followed the Amazon from the highlands of Quito to the Atlantic in search of the Golden Realm. His men endured starvation, arrows, and disease, eating leather and bark before the river carried them to safety. They found no city, but their ordeal gave Europe its first map of the world's greatest river, and its first certainty that somewhere along its course El Dorado waited. Another conqueror, Sebastián de Benalcázar, pushed south through what is now Ecuador, certain the Muisca's treasures had drifted downstream from a greater source. His rival Gonzalo Pizarro, brother to the conqueror of Peru, marched east with hundreds of soldiers, slaves, and horses, chasing rumors of golden lakes. They lost nearly all, men to hunger, beasts to mud, sanity to heat, and returned broken but unrepentant. The failure itself became fuel. If such suffering was endured, surely it had been for something real. The more the jungle devoured them, the brighter the legend burned. Each survivor became a prophet of gold, each corpse a marker on the road to heaven. In Europe, their tales were read as revelation. The chroniclers who compiled them, Gomera, Herrera, Oviedo, turned their exhaustion into epic, their delusion into destiny. Artists painted maps of continents laced with rivers of gold. The Pope's geographers debated whether the Golden Kingdom might be the same land once ruled by King Solomon's sailors, or perhaps the western shore of Plato's Atlantis raised again from the sea. The age of discovery was becoming an age of obsession. Spanish governors bankrupted themselves raising expeditions. Priests preached sermons on divine providence and the wealth of pagan lands. The language of the explorers mixed faith and avarice until they were indistinguishable. They spoke of spreading the gospel, but carried chains and crucibles. They prayed for souls, but searched for veins of ore. The dream of El Dorado had transformed into a theology of conquest. The belief that God rewarded those who sought his treasures with blood and endurance. No seeker embodied that faith more tragically than Sir Walter Raleigh. A century after Quesada's march, when England challenged Spain for empire, Raleigh revived the legend as cause for exploration and proof of divine favor. In 1595, he sailed to Guyana, convinced that deep within its forests lay the city of Manoa, the golden capital of El Dorado. His journals spoke of an empire greater than Peru, where gold grows like fruit upon the trees. His men found only rivers choked with weeds, villages burned by earlier Spanish raids, and endless silence. Yet upon his return, Raleigh published his discovery of Guyana, describing the land as paradise itself, its birds like jewels in motion, its air a continual spring. He called it the inheritance of righteous kings, waiting to be claimed by Christian hands. The book transformed failure into prophecy. London buzzed with talk of the Golden City. Investors poured fortunes into new voyages. Raleigh returned to Guyana 20 years later, grey and weakened, driven by the same illusion. His son died in battle there. Raleigh himself returned in disgrace and was executed. Yet his words endured, feeding the myth he had sought to prove. By then, El Dorado had become a mirror in which Europe saw itself. It reflected the hunger of an age intoxicated by discovery, the faith that the world still held secrets meant for the bold. To the priests, the Golden Kingdom was divine reward for the spread of the gospel. To the crown, it was tribute waiting in foreign soil. To the common soldier, it was heaven purchased by courage. Each believed he pursued glory. Each found ruin. The years that followed littered the jungles with their bones. Expeditions vanished into the Amazon without a trace. Canoes overturned in flooded rivers. Men wandered in circles until they drank the swamps themselves. Those who returned brought stories of horrors and wonders indistinguishable. Tribes with eyes of gold, lakes that swallowed whole armies, stones that sang in the night. Every account made the city more unreachable. Every rumor moved it farther away. Yet the failure of discovery never weakened belief. It transformed it. The more elusive El Dorado became, the more it resembled a spiritual quest. Chroniclers began to speak of the kingdom as paradise itself, a place visible only to those without greed. A Jesuit missionary wrote in 1637 that the Golden City is not to be found by those who seek gold, but by those who seek God. In that paradox, the legend reached its maturity. Still, greed did not release its grip. Mapmakers continued to sketch the shining city in the margins of their charts. The river systems of South America, Orinoco, Negro, Amazon, were drawn as arteries feeding one great heart of gold. Empires rose and collapsed around that belief, and through it all, the jungle remained silent, its canopy closing over the footprints of men who had come to conquer paradise. By the dawn of the 18th century, the quest had slowed, but the hunger persisted. The Golden Kingdom no longer belonged to Spain or England alone. It had become a symbol for all of Europe's restless ambition. It was the dream that justified empire, the mirage that sanctified greed, the final echo of the old myths. Atlantis drowned, Shambhala hidden, and now El Dorado forever just beyond reach. For centuries, the Spaniards had crossed oceans in search of a perfect city. What they found instead was a reflection of their own desire, a paradise that dissolved the closer they came to it, leaving only gold dust on their hands and silence in their souls. Silence ruled the jungle long after conquistadors had vanished from its rivers. Across those green immensities, the myth of the Golden City refused to die, shifting from one horizon to another, like light across water. No explorer could agree where it might stand. Guyana, Ecuador, Brazil. Yet none dared to doubt its existence. Failure itself seemed to prove that success must lie just beyond sight. And so, as centuries turned, new expeditions marched into the heat and mist, chasing a promise that had outlived every empire. Men who returned from those forests, burned, delirious, half-mad, spoke less of gold than of endlessness. They described rivers looping through eternity, mountains rising into storms, and plains where air and earth merged into vapor. Each tale offered fragments of wonder, a city glimpsed through haze, a lake that swallowed sunlight whole, ruins devoured by vines. Cartographers stitched those fragments into emerald seas on their maps and scrawled across them a single name: El Dorado. Belief thrived wherever knowledge faltered. While Europe argued over theology and reason, adventurers still trusted rumor more than proof. Among them strode Pedro de Ursua, sent to pacify the Amazon, and his lieutenant Lope de Aguirre, whose ambition curdled into madness. Declaring himself Wrath of God, Prince of El Dorado, he led his starving men through fever and flood until his rebellion ended in slaughter. Chroniclers later called him both cursed and visionary, a man who mistook his own reflection for the city he sought. Missionaries gave the legend a different shape. Jesuits working along the Orinoco recorded stories of a gilded king who ruled a realm of eternal spring. Some condemned these tales as pagan temptation. Others saw in them the echo of Eden. One priest wrote, "Perhaps the Lord hides paradise behind these walls of thorn that only the faithful may enter." In their sermons, the Golden City became a test of virtue rather than a prize of conquest. Yet even faith could not silence hunger. Across the 17th century, the search for El Dorado hardened into ritual. Spanish governors pledged their fortunes to expeditions. English captains used it to justify raids, and chroniclers turned each disaster into divine instruction. When Philip von Hutton's company vanished near the Orinoco, survivors claimed they had reached the edge of paradise itself. Martyrdom fed the myth more surely than success. Few stories captured its spell, like the final voyage of Sir Walter Raleigh. Old and ill, condemned yet unrepentant, he sailed once more to Guyana in 1617, convinced that Manoa still gleamed beyond the next bend of the river. His son fell in battle. His ships rotted in the rain. Back in England, awaiting death, Raleigh still spoke of the city as if he had walked its streets. "I have seen the sun rise upon a kingdom of gold," he told his guards, "and though I die, others will find it." They did not. They found only the dream he left behind. As the Enlightenment dawned, exploration turned into science, yet wonder survived beneath its instruments. Charles-Marie de la Condamine, tracing the equator, heard the same stories from villagers on the Amazon's banks, of a lake too deep for light, of towers hidden by cloud. Natural philosophers dismissed such visions, but never entirely. Some suggested geological illusions, others remnants of prehistoric civilizations. The rational mind, for all its skepticism, could not ignore how the legend refused extinction. Empire, meanwhile, transfigured the myth into justification. Governors and courtiers described South America as the treasury of creation, an Eden awaiting order. The mines of Potosi and Cartagena disgorged mountains of silver and gold, yet each ingot fed the same delusion, that the true heart of riches lay still undiscovered. The continent itself became El Dorado, its forests and peoples treated as veins to be opened. Among the Muisca, the story returned home as lament. Their sacred lake at Guatavita, once a vessel of offering, was torn apart by Spaniards who believed its depths lined with bullion. When the drained waters revealed only fragments, gods of hammered gold, mirrors of polished stone, the intruders called it disappointment, but the people saw balance restored. The lake filled again, and the jungle reclaimed its silence. By the Romantic Age, the lost kingdom had escaped geography entirely. Poets and painters turned it into symbol, the shining ghost of all impossible desires. Edgar Allan Poe's knight rode forever through the valley of shadow, seeking the realm of gold that lay beyond death. Artists filled their canvases with visions of cities suspended in light. El Dorado had become the landscape of longing itself, the paradise built not from earth, but from yearning. Exploration's modern airs still chased it through the 19th century. Sir Robert Schomburgk, mapping British Guiana, spoke of waterfalls flashing like molten metal. Alexander von Humboldt, though skeptical, called the myth the poetry of geography, admitting that it had led men deeper into truth by luring them with illusion. Each step of discovery was also a confession. The jungle's greatest treasure was not its gold, but the questions it inspired. That same fever claimed its last champion in Percy Fawcett, the British explorer who disappeared into Brazil in 1925 while searching for the city of Z. He believed he would find a lost civilization of perfect order hidden among the rivers. Letters found later revealed a faith indistinguishable from obsession. "The answer lies ahead," he wrote. "It calls, and I must go." Nothing more was heard. The forest absorbed him as it had all who came before. In the age of airplanes and radio, the myth persisted, less as map than mirror. Scholars spoke of collective archetypes, of the human need to believe in hidden perfection. Economists compared El Dorado to progress itself, the perpetual horizon, never reached, always promised. Psychologists called it projection. Poets called it faith. Whatever the language, the hunger was the same. The yearning to redeem the world through discovery, to turn darkness into gold. By the close of the 20th century, satellites had mapped every bend of the Amazon, yet the Golden City remained untouched. Its meaning had changed, but its light had not. For the modern imagination, El Dorado was the symbol of ambition's double edge, proof that the line between enlightenment and destruction runs thin as sunlight on a river. Long after compasses grew silent and governments claimed the last unknown lands, the legend continued to gleam in the human mind. It had never been a city to be found, but a question to be answered. What price will humanity pay for its dream of perfection? Somewhere between faith and folly, El Dorado still waits, not in jungle depths, but in every desire that glitters too brightly to be true. In the 19th century, the world began to shrink beneath the compass and the camera. The blank spaces that had once harbored gods and empires vanished under the advancing lines of surveyors. Oceans that had concealed Atlantis became lanes of steamships. Mountains that hid Shambhala were crossed by explorers armed with barometers and notebooks. Yet even as the age of reason illuminated the map, it could not extinguish the hunger for wonder. The more the world was measured, the more people longed for what measurement could not reach. Archaeology was the new priesthood of that longing. Across the Near East, spades struck soil where scripture and legend had long intertwined. When Heinrich Schliemann uncovered the walls of Troy in 1871, he did more than prove a poem's geography. He proved that myth itself might contain history. The discovery echoed like revelation. If Homer had been right, then why not Plato? If Troy, once dismissed as fable, had slept beneath the dust of Anatolia, might Atlantis not lie beneath the Atlantic's restless skin? Each triumph of science became fuel for new belief. The same telescopes that charted the heavens inspired questions about the gods who might dwell there. The same museums that displayed ancient skeletons whispered of forgotten races. Scholars who read cuneiform tablets from Nineveh found within them the flood of Gilgamesh and the fall of divine cities, the very pattern that had shaped every lost civilization myth since Sumer. Excavation blurred into resurrection. The modern mind, no longer content with faith, demanded evidence, yet sought it in the same ancient stories it claimed to transcend. Explorers began to chase legends with instruments instead of prayers. The British Empire, mapping the world in the name of knowledge, became accidental custodian of every myth it encountered. In India, surveyors studied Himalayan valleys, once described by monks as the roads to Shambhala, their reports noting extraordinary geomagnetic disturbances and unmapped monasteries. In South America, geologists analyzing river sediments rediscovered rumors of cities buried beneath the Amazon, remnants of civilizations dismissed as impossible by earlier colonizers. Everywhere, the old stories stirred beneath new disciplines. By the early 20th century, the rediscovery of Troy had inspired a generation of seekers who believed the boundary between legend and science was an error of imagination. They saw in each myth not fantasy, but encrypted history. To them, Atlantis was a geological event, Shambhala, an esoteric memory of real kingdoms in Central Asia, El Dorado, a distorted record of pre-Columbian cities awaiting excavation. What ancient poets had dreamed, modern science would uncover. Among these visionaries stood Percy Fawcett, a soldier turned explorer whose search for the city of Z fused the rigor of survey with the fervor of pilgrimage. His expeditions through Brazil's Mato Grosso were chronicled in reports that oscillated between military precision and mystical conviction. "I expect to find," he wrote, "the cradle of an ancient world, built upon order, not savagery." He vanished in 1925, leaving behind only his compass and his faith. To the newspapers of London and New York, his disappearance was tragedy. To the public, it was confirmation. Somewhere beyond the last mapped river, the modern world still met its mystery. In the deserts of Arabia, another myth was stirring. The Quran spoke of Iram, of the pillars, the Atlantis of the sands, a city of splendor destroyed by divine wrath. For centuries it had remained metaphor, a warning to those who defied heaven. Then, in the early 1990s, satellite imagery revealed strange patterns beneath the Rub al-Khali, ancient caravan routes converging on a buried settlement near Shaisra in Oman. Archaeologists uncovered ruins long hidden by sand, stone walls, pottery, traces of trade in frankincense. NASA's remote sensing team called it Ubar, the city of Iram reborn. The headlines proclaimed, "Atlantis found in Arabia." Science had given myth a second life. For the first time, legends were not dismissed but pursued with data. Satellites that once spied armies now mapped forgotten civilizations. Sonar scanned ocean floors for signs of Plato's island. Each technological advance rekindled the same hope, that what had been imagined could now be proven. The Atlantic seafloor near the Azores, the Caribbean shelves off Cuba, the Aegean caldera of Thera all became candidates for the drowned empire. Expeditions set out with submarines, radar, and computer models, each finding formations that seemed, for a moment, to align with the philosopher's words. None yielded certainty, but every discovery kept the legend alive. The new century turned mythology into method. Anthropologists compared flood stories from distant continents and found their patterns identical. Civilizations punished by water, heroes who preserved knowledge through catastrophe, cities destined to rise again. Geologists uncovered evidence of abrupt sea level changes at the end of the last ice age, real events that might have engraved themselves into human memory as universal myth. The lost city had become shorthand for collective trauma, a memory of survival disguised as poetry. Meanwhile, mysticism adapted to modernity. Theosophists, spiritualists, and occult scholars claimed that Atlantis and Shambhala were not places at all, but dimensions of consciousness, symbols of humanity's evolution. Helena Blavatsky and her followers spoke of root races and cosmic cycles, of civilizations that rose and fell as the spirit advanced through time. Their writings blurred science with revelation, presenting myth as metaphysics. The old stories survived because they could evolve faster than skepticism. Each rediscovery, real or imagined, mirrored its age. The Victorians saw in Atlantis the grandeur of empire. The early 20th century saw technological hubris and cosmic punishment. During the Cold War, both superpowers sought legitimacy in the past. Russia, in its fascination with Shambhala as a myth of hidden power. America, in its obsessions with Atlantean technology buried beneath the sea. Myth had become modern language for human aspiration, reinterpreted through politics and progress alike. The paradox of the modern age was thus complete. Science, having dethroned the gods, had inherited their stories. Archaeology replaced scripture, telescopes replaced prophecy, but the hunger remained the same: to locate the beginning, to touch the divine through evidence. Every ruin unearthed, every fossilized tablet, every photograph of a buried road seemed to whisper that humanity was not discovering, but remembering. By the close of the 20th century, the frontier between fact and legend had dissolved. What had begun as faith had become experiment. What began as allegory ended as data point. Yet in the laboratories and archives, the same old yearning persisted, the desire to find, beneath layers of sediment or circuitry, the lost perfection from which history had fallen. Myth, it seemed, could not be disproved, only reinterpreted. And so, the modern world, confident in its mastery of truth, found itself wandering the same old deserts, guided by new instruments, but driven by ancient hope. Whether the destination was Atlantis beneath the waves, Shambhala behind the peaks, or Iram beneath the sands, the journey was always the same, the endless search for what was once whole. Science had redrawn the map, but it had not freed humanity from its oldest inheritance: the need to believe that somewhere, hidden under data or dust, the first paradise still sleeps. By the dawn of the 21st century, the myths that had once lived in temples and taverns now pulsed through satellites and digital archives. Every lost city had become a hypothesis, every legend a dataset waiting to be verified. Yet behind the machinery of discovery, the same old hunger still guided the search, the longing to touch what history had buried, to prove that the dreams of our ancestors were not in vain. New technology turned curiosity into revelation. Oceanographers scanning the Atlantic seafloor with sonar discovered geometric patterns that stirred excitement and disbelief in equal measure. One expedition off the coast of Cuba reported symmetrical structures deep below the waves, resembling avenues and plazas. The images, grainy but evocative, ignited headlines around the world. Atlantis found. Governments hesitated to fund follow-up dives. Skeptics called the formations natural. Still, the idea took root. For a moment, the ocean seemed once again the mirror of myth. Elsewhere, satellites tracing the shifting sands of Arabia refined the discoveries first made in Oman. Desert archaeologists using ground-penetrating radar identified ancient trade networks that once connected Yemen to Syria, proof that the vanished city of Iram, once dismissed as parable, had indeed stood at the crossroads of empires. When the buried fortress at Shisar yielded pottery from the first millennium BC, the scientists named it Ubar, a word that trembled between faith and fact. For believers, the Quranic legend had found its bones. For skeptics, it was coincidence wrapped in wishful thinking. Science had not slain myth, it had given it new grammar. Each discovery, no matter how small, was framed in the language of the miraculous. Archaeologists spoke of resurrection and awakening, journalists of Atlantis beneath the sand. The modern world, having replaced gods with equations, had learned to worship evidence with equal fervor. The microscope and the myth served the same impulse, to bridge the gulf between what is known and what must be believed. Academia, unwilling to yield the field entirely to dreamers, began to treat legends as cultural code. Anthropologists charted the geography of belief, tracing how flood narratives, underworlds, and hidden kingdoms recurred across continents separated by oceans and millennia. Geneticists compared DNA sequences of ancient populations and found traces of migrations that echoed the directions of myth. The notion of Atlantis as memory rather than map, an allegory for humanity's shared origin, gained cautious respect. Science, once the enemy of wonder, had become its reluctant interpreter. Still, fascination bred excess. Pseudo-archaeologists filled bookstores with claims that satellites had located Atlantean runways in the Sahara, that ice cores from Greenland preserved records of a prehistoric empire destroyed by comet strike. Television turned discovery into spectacle. Documentaries promised answers between advertisements. In laboratories and living rooms alike, the line between evidence and imagination thinned. Mythology, stripped of its temples, now lived in pixels and prime time. Even within serious research, a quiet faith persisted. Marine archaeologists who descended in submersibles to survey the continental shelves confessed to feeling awe as sonar outlines emerged from the dark. Columns of rock shaped like walls, ridges that resembled roads. Every expedition, one said, is an act of hope. They were not seeking gold or glory, but confirmation that the human story is older and grander than textbooks allow. Beneath the instruments lay a yearning that data alone could not satisfy. Shambhala, too, survived the age of satellites. In the ruins of monasteries rebuilt after decades of war, monks continued the Kalachakra ritual, describing a kingdom unseen by the impure. Western visitors, now arriving with cameras rather than crosses, sat in candlelight listening to chants older than their nations. To them, the hidden kingdom no longer needed to exist on a map. It existed as a metaphor for the peace modernity could not produce. In that quiet inversion, the myth found its refuge. When every secret seemed revealed, mystery became sacred again. The rediscovery of Troy had once proven that myth could turn to stone. The rediscovery of Ubar, that faith could turn to evidence. Yet both victories pointed to a deeper paradox. The more the world uncovered, the less it understood what it sought. Each excavation stripped away not only sand, but meaning. A ruin verified was a wonder diminished. Perhaps that was why the most enduring legends resisted proof. They survived because they could not be reduced to measurement. As the new millennium advanced, scholars began to speak of the archaeology of imagination. Their field was not physical ground, but the terrain of collective memory, the way civilizations encoded moral truths in landscapes. Atlantis embodied punishment for hubris, Shambhala, redemption through wisdom. El Dorado, the illusion of material salvation. Modern rediscoveries had changed their setting, but not their lesson. The myths still spoke of the same human dilemma. Knowledge without humility leads always to ruin. In that light, technology became a double-edged tool. The same satellites that traced buried cities also mapped the scars of deforestation. The same sonar that searched for Atlantis charted melting ice. Science, having fulfilled its promise to uncover the world, now revealed its fragility. The lost cities were no longer warnings from the past. They were prophecies of the future. Civilizations drowned by pride and neglect were no longer ancient allegories, but familiar headlines. Perhaps that is why the myths endure. They remind the modern age that progress and perdition share the same horizon. Atlantis warns of the sea that rises. Shambhala whispers of the wisdom that endures. El Dorado glitters with the vanity that blinds. Beneath data and theory, the same moral pulse persists. The world can be measured, but it cannot be owned. By centuries' end, the rediscovery of myth had come full circle. Archaeology had vindicated memory, and technology had revived awe. Humanity had walked through its desert of truth and found the mirage still waiting on the far side, unchanged, undiminished. The lost cities had not been recovered, but something older had been. The realization that wonder itself is the final inheritance. In laboratories and monasteries, deserts and oceans, the search continues, not for gold or glory, but for the confirmation that the past still speaks. Science and legend now travel together, uneasy companions under the same vast sky, chasing the same horizon where reason ends and belief begins. There, in that shimmering boundary between evidence and faith, the lost world forever waits. Even after the maps had been filled and the last blank spaces erased, humanity kept wandering. The search for lost cities did not end with discovery. It merely turned inward. What the ancients had imagined beneath the sea, behind the mountains, or within the jungle, began to flicker in the human mind itself. Atlantis, Shambhala, El Dorado, each once placed on the edge of the world, had become metaphors for the edges of the soul. In the silence following 2 world wars, the myth of progress cracked, and people looked again to older dreams for meaning. Archaeology, psychology, and philosophy converged upon the same terrain, the invisible geography of belief. Carl Jung wrote of archetypes rising from the collective unconscious, patterns as ancient as the myths that had shaped civilization. He called them the architecture of the mind, the inner Atlantis that lies beneath reason, the Shambhala where wholeness hides, the El Dorado of desire forever gleaming just beyond reach. For the first time, science itself began to suggest that myth was not false but inwardly true. The ruins unearthed across the 20th century deepened that realization. Excavations in Crete, Harappa, and Persepolis revealed not miracles but continuity, each civilization rising from the bones of another, each believing itself eternal. What scholars called layers of habitation, poets called memory. To stand amid those stones was to sense a pattern older than empire, that every city, no matter how mighty, carries within it the seed of loss. The fall of Atlantis, the concealment of Shambhala, the mirage of El Dorado, each reflected that hidden cycle by which human greatness dissolves into dust and dreams are reborn as stories. Historians of the post-war world, confronted with ruins of their own making, read those myths as mirrors of modernity. The drowned island became the allegory of technological arrogance, the paradise behind the mountains a symbol of spiritual exile, the golden kingdom the warning against material excess. Even amid skyscrapers and satellites, the patterns remained unchanged. Progress had delivered power, not wisdom. Knowledge had multiplied, but meaning had thinned. The world, illuminated by science, seemed once again in darkness. Artists turned to the old myths, not to escape modern life, but to diagnose it. Painters cast their cities half submerged in light. Sculptors built towers that seemed to drown upward. Poets invoked Atlantis as the shadow beneath civilization's brightness. The voice that asks whether reason alone can save what it creates. In literature, the lost city became the stage for humanity's oldest drama, the conflict between memory and forgetting. From Thomas Mann's sea-bound reflections to Borges's labyrinths of time, the myths survived because they revealed what logic could not, the shape of longing itself. Philosophers found in those stories the moral that history had forgotten. Atlantis warned that pride destroys the very order it seeks to perfect. Shambhala reminded that purity cannot be imposed, only cultivated. El Dorado confessed that the hunger for paradise can corrupt the paradise it seeks. Together they formed a trilogy of human experience: moral fall, spiritual renewal, and material temptation, each perpetually reenacting the other. The modern age, no less than antiquity, moved through the same cycle with new instruments and old desires. The quest, stripped of gold and prophecy, persisted in quieter ways. Scientists who drilled cores from polar ice or mapped distant galaxies spoke of awe with language older than religion. Philosophers studying consciousness discovered in its depths the same mysteries monks had once described in mountain caves. Even the astronauts who first looked back upon the blue sphere of Earth confessed that they felt as though they had glimpsed the lost world entire, the cradle, the kingdom, the city. Perhaps, one said, Atlantis was never beneath us, but around us all along. As global culture expanded, the boundaries between myths blurred. Tibetan lamas met Western physicists, Amazonian shamans spoke at academic conferences, and explorers of the mind replaced explorers of the map. The myths of drowned islands and hidden valleys merged with psychological language, integration, enlightenment, transcendence. Shambhala became not a place beyond the Himalayas, but a state beyond ego. El Dorado, not a hoard of gold, but a radiant simplicity. Atlantis, once symbol of punishment, turned into metaphor for memory, the desire to recover harmony lost when humanity chose power over balance. Technology, which had once promised mastery, deepened the paradox. Virtual worlds and digital realities multiplied, echoing the old longing to build perfection beyond imperfection. In the gleam of screens, cities of glass and code rose faster than any of stone. Yet beneath their brilliance, the same questions persisted. What does it mean to lose oneself in one's own creation? Can a civilization that remakes the world avoid drowning in its reflection? Each innovation seemed to reenact Plato's warning in circuitry and light. Environmental ruin gave the myths new urgency. As oceans rose and forests burned, Atlantis ceased to be allegory and became prophecy. Scientists speaking before the United Nations invoked the drowned island as warning that hubris still brings flood, even without gods to send it. Shambhala, in turn, inspired movements for ecological balance, its teachings reinterpreted as metaphors for harmony between human and nature. An El Dorado returned in every fevered rush for oil, silicon, or data, the golden mirage still gleaming over deserts of greed. Religion, too, rediscovered the legends it once condemned. Christian theologians reimagined Atlantis as humanity's fall from grace through knowledge without reverence. Buddhist scholars described Shambhala as the potential for enlightenment within all beings. Latin American mystics reclaimed El Dorado as an indigenous paradise defiled by conquest yet surviving in spirit. The three myths, separated by continents, now spoke a common language: the conviction that paradise, whether lost or hidden, remains reachable only through transformation, not possession. By the century's close, the lost cities had converged into a single landscape of the human condition. The philosopher's ocean, the monk's mountain, the explorer's jungle, all pointed toward the same invisible center. Atlantis was the shadow of the intellect, Shambhala the light of the heart, El Dorado the flame of desire. Together they charted the triangle of our restless nature: reason seeking order, spirit seeking peace, hunger seeking fulfillment. The myths endured not because they were believed, but because they described what belief itself requires: the endless motion between ignorance and understanding. Perhaps that is why, in an age that has mapped every frontier, the legends still refuse extinction. They survive because they have migrated into the traveler himself. The real journey no longer begins at the shore, but in the mind that yearns to cross it. Every scientist peering into the atom, every mystic descending into silence, every artist sketching the shape of wonder continues the same ancient pursuit. The tools have changed, the longing has not. In the end, the three lost worlds stand not as relics, but as mirrors. Atlantis speaks of memory, what civilization remembers and what it forgets. Shambhala promises renewal, the perfection that endures when the outer world fails. El Dorado warns of illusion, the brilliance that blinds those who chase it. Between them lies the path of humanity, circling forever through creation, ruin, and rediscovery. Each legend, when stripped of geography, reveals the same horizon: the city within, waiting to be found not by explorers, but by those who remember why they began to seek. At the threshold of the modern age, when satellites could pierce clouds and algorithms could measure tides, the world discovered that mystery could not be erased. It could only change its shape. The lost cities that had once occupied the edges of maps now lived in the imagination, not as ruins to be found, but as reflections to be understood. Humanity had conquered distance, but not desire. The search that had begun in temples and legends now unfolded in psychology, philosophy, and the quiet corridors of memory. The archaeologists of the mind replaced those of the soil. The philosophers who studied consciousness spoke of layers as deep as any strata of earth, beneath thought, beneath language, beneath time. Each layer, they said, held relics, the mythic architectures of longing, fear, and faith that guided civilization long before history began. Jung called these fragments archetypes, but they were also cities. Atlantis sunk in the unconscious, Shambhala veiled in meditation, El Dorado gleaming at the horizon of desire. They were the landscapes of the human soul, shaped by emotion rather than erosion, revealed not through digging, but through remembering. Artists of the 20th century made those inner cities visible again. Painters filled canvases with drowned metropolises rising through blue light. Composers built symphonies around the rhythm of waves and bells that never rang. In the language of art, Atlantis was not destruction, but renewal, proof that even after collapse, beauty can resurface. Poets followed, turning the mythic into personal confession. When Yeats wrote of a terrible beauty born, he echoed the philosopher's warning and the explorer's dream, that creation and ruin are inseparable, that every paradise carries its own flood. spiritual movements found in the old triad, a framework for modern faith. New interpretations of the Kalachakra Tantra spoke of Shambhala as a state of inner revolution rather than a geographic refuge. To find it, one had to turn away from conquest and toward compassion. Western seekers, weary of material promise, crossed to Himalayan monasteries or inward through meditation, discovering that the kingdom's gates opened not in mountains, but in silence. As one Tibetan teacher said to a visitor, "You have come too far to travel. The road was behind your eyes all along." El Dorado, too, reappeared. In the stock exchanges of New York, in the glittering towers of cities built upon credit and hunger. The gold of the New World was no longer metal, but ambition, extracted not from mines, but from time and labor. Economies rose and crashed like waves, mirroring the same pattern that had once sent ships across oceans. The pursuit of infinite wealth proved, once more, that the lust for perfection can turn paradise into desert. El Dorado had merely changed currency. Even the myth of Atlantis, long buried under skepticism, resurfaced as metaphor for ecological loss. As glaciers melted and seas crept inland, the image of a drowned world no longer belonged to philosophers. It belonged to scientists, policymakers, and children learning of rising tides. What had once been allegory for divine punishment had become a warning written in climate reports. Civilization, it seemed, had finally made Plato's prophecy its own. Through these convergences, the myths merged into a single truth, that the lost cities were never destinations but diagnoses. Each one named an aspect of the same condition. Atlantis, the intellect corrupted by power. Shambhala, the spirit preserved through wisdom. El Dorado, the desire that devours itself. Together they formed a map of the human paradox, that the same forces which create greatness also destroy it, and that salvation lies not in escape but in understanding. To stand at the end of this long journey is to see how circular it has always been. The earliest storytellers spoke of a paradise drowned or hidden. Their descendants sailed, climbed, and bled to find it. The modern mind, stripped of faith, yet starved of meaning, rebuilds it in dreams. Every age, convinced of its difference, repeats the same pilgrimage under new banners. Science, empire, progress, salvation, each chasing an image of wholeness it cannot hold. The cities are eternal because the need for them is eternal. Yet something remains beyond tragedy. If humanity cannot escape its cycle, it can at least recognize its reflection. In the myths of loss, there is also mercy. Every fall implies a chance to rise. Every destruction conceals renewal. The drowned island warns against arrogance, but also promises rebirth. The hidden kingdom proves that truth survives obscurity. The golden mirage reveals that beauty persists even when misunderstood. In their endurance lies hope, the assurance that even ruin cannot silence the will to begin again. Modern seekers may travel not by ship or caravan, but through thought, art, and empathy, yet the destination remains unchanged. The quest is no longer to locate the lost, but to embody it, to rebuild Atlantis in justice, to awaken Shambhala in compassion, to temper El Dorado with humility. The age of exploration has turned into the age of responsibility, the recognition that the real ruins are not beneath the sea, but within the heart, and that the work of discovery begins by restoring what greed and pride have undone. And so the circle closes. From the clay of Sumer to the stars of the modern sky, humanity has pursued the same horizon. A world once perfect, now lost, yet somehow recoverable through memory and meaning. The map has folded inward. The cities have moved into the mind. In their silence, they wait for the next traveler, who will understand that every myth, every empire, every dream of gold or glory was only ever a language through which the soul tried to name itself. Somewhere beyond reason and within remembrance, Atlantis still shimmers beneath invisible waves. Shambhala glows beyond the peaks, and El Dorado burns in the heart's farthest chamber. Humanity will never cease to seek them, because to seek them is to remain human. The journey endures across oceans, centuries, and selves, toward the cities that were never lost, only waiting to be seen.